When you hear the word history, you probably think of this, and you think of learning about him in this. But history is not just the story of dead presidents written in dry textbooks. During the next 5 minutes or so, you'll learn that there are many different types of histories and historical sources. By the end of this podcast, students will be able to identify at least 5 distinct schools of historical inquiry, describe the difference between a primary source and a secondary source, and explain the advantages and disadvantages of both types of sources for students of history. Yes, some history does deal with this. The study of George Washington's time as general of the Patriot forces during the Revolutionary War belongs to the field of military history. An analysis of his actions as first president of the United States falls under the domain of political history. Within that time, a closer look at Washington's foreign policy would be classified as diplomatic history. If we looked at the types of books Washington read and examined his writings about them, we might be regarded as intellectual historians. And if we surveyed life on Washington's plantation and how he treated his slaves, we might be characterized as historians of the African American experience or experts on the history of race. So you see, even within the life of a single person, many types of histories abound. In addition to the types of histories I just mentioned, other popular subsets of American historiography are social history, cultural history, women's history, the histories of Native, Asian, and Hispanic Americans, and the history of gender, sexuality, and LGBTQ people. Our course will touch a bit on all of these subfields. Today, it's quite common for historians' works to transcend boundaries and deal with more than one subfield. Present-day concerns often open historians' eyes to different aspects of the past. For example, the civil rights movement of the 1960s witnessed an explosion in the field of African American studies. Thus, the study of history is never static. As today's society changes, so too do the lenses through which we view the past. Just as there are a variety of subfields within the broader field of American history, the types of sources that different historians might use to discover the past is infinite. There are 2 main types of historical sources: primary sources and secondary sources. Primary sources are created by people who witnessed or recorded an event firsthand. Examples of primary sources are diaries, autobiographies, memoirs, photographs, love letters, political speeches, newspaper articles, historical maps, paintings, buildings, sculpture, songs, gravestones, census records, text messages, subway graffiti, emails, and almost anything created at any point in the past. There are benefits and disadvantages to historians who use primary sources in their writing. But in general, primary sources are the lifeblood of the historian's craft. Primary sources make history writing come alive. Without primary sources, the evidence or stuff of the past, historians would know nothing about the past. However, because primary sources provide only one person's viewpoint at a single moment in the past, they are biased and therefore must be examined with a skeptical eye. Unlike how we talk of bias today, usually in the form of racial bias, historical bias is not necessarily bad. Historical bias means that the person who created the primary source possessed a particular viewpoint shaped by his or her own particular life story. For example, when we read the Declaration of Independence's words, "All men are created equal," it is helpful to know that the author, Thomas Jefferson, was both a white man and a slave owner. He may have had blind spots that prevented him from writing instead, "All men and women, black and red as well as white, are created equal." Likewise, you and I and every person living possess our own particular historical biases when we create the primary sources that will become the evidence or stuff of tomorrow's history. The second main type of historical source is a secondary source. These are the biographies, monographs, scholarly articles, and edited volumes written by scholars. Usually, secondary sources are based on the historian's examination of many primary sources, as well as her contextualization of those primary sources within existing secondary source literature written by other historians. Because the work of historians builds on each other in this way, the practice of citing others' work is so important. Proper citation allows readers to follow up on specific parts of a secondary source that interest them and to continue the creation of new historical works in the future. We will look at citation in more detail at a later time in this course. Technically, a third and final type of historical source exists, the tertiary source. This type of source is usually a compilation of information from many secondary and sometimes some primary sources. Common examples of tertiary sources includes textbooks and encyclopedia. Historians usually do not use information from tertiary sources in their writing. When they do, they always paraphrase tertiary sources rather than quote them directly, though both usages would be cited. Therefore, in our class, we will follow this practice of spare usage and always paraphrasing information from your textbook. The advantage of incorporating both secondary and tertiary sources into your own writing is that the information contained in them generally provides necessary context. In addition, secondary and tertiary sources usually contain less bias than primary sources, since they are based on many sources rather than just on one person's viewpoint. However, even secondary and tertiary sources are influenced by the political and philosophical viewpoints of their authors. Nevertheless, the major drawback to papers that rely too heavily on secondary and tertiary sources is that a certain flatness or dullness comes into the writing. Remember, it's the primary sources that make history come alive. In conclusion, there are many different subfields of American history, and each of them might use some of the many different varieties of primary and secondary sources. As we progress through this course, you too will have the opportunity to learn from primary and secondary sources. In fact, a major goal of our course is to begin to learn how to synthesize primary and secondary sources in analytical paragraphs. We'll do this type of exercise this week in our analysis of the Puritans of New England, and we'll practice this skill several more times before you synthesize your analysis of the Hall of Fame with secondary sources on America at the turn of the 20th century. In the meanwhile, keep your eyes open as you walk down the street, through campus, and in your own home to the wonderful histories waiting to be discovered there all around you.